AIWSSF is an organization of students from women's studies and gender studies disciplines all over India. This platform aims to mainstream the Department of Women's Studies and to make way forward. So far, we have already conducted 7 webinars with emerite professors of women's studies. Today is our 8th webinar, and here we have one special guest to give introductory remarks and speakers to deliver a lecture on the topic Queer Theory and LGBTQIA Studies in Social Science Research by Dr. Ponni Arasu. Dr. Ponni Arasu is a historian and lawyer by training. She has finished her PhD in History, South Asian, Tamil and Gender Studies on the historical ethnography of public political lives in Tamil Nadu from the 1950s to 70s. Her PhD research makes an intervention in histories of caste and gender in the Tamil context. Before this, she worked at the Alternative Law Forum for many years, working on a range of issues as lawyer and research, including caste, labor, right to democratic dissent, etc., including the campaign against Section 377 of the IPC. She had been a member of many queer collectives in Delhi. She is an actor and has worked with the Marapachi feminist collective in Tamil Nadu on numerous theatre productions. She now lives in Batticaloa in eastern Sri Lanka, does research on the connection between economies of food growth and women's everyday lives, and is a teacher in history, gender studies, and theatre to the next generation of Tamil-speaking youngsters in Sri Lanka. She is a long-standing member of the Indian Association of Women's Studies. Without wasting our time, we can start our sessions. Over to you, Ponni.
Thanks a lot, Arvi. I think I'm glad that we don't have a unwieldy crowd of 60, 100 people that sometimes these Zoom things happen to attract. I hope we can have something of a discussion. Is my sound and video clear?
Yes, you are.
Yeah? Okay. Okay. So I've prepared something for today, and it consists of a few different parts. First, we're going to begin with something of a almost like a background list, as it were, of all the important literature that's come out of queerness and queerness in the Indian context. This is by no stretch of imagination exhaustive, but it may be repetitive for some of you, so I apologize, please bear with me. And for those who may not have come across this literature before, this will be a good starting point, and you can hopefully take notes and look them up and take it from there. I'm also making a few conscious choices in terms of scholarship, and you'll try that. Not all academics or people who are engaged in academic writing, but are also engaged in lots of other things, and people who are primarily based in this region of the world rather than in the global north. So I'll just go straight into it. And if you need to stop me at any point, please say so on chat. I'm fully adept at Zoom at this point, and so I will keep looking at my chat as well. Thank you so much for the opportunity. So this class or talk or whatever it may be, I'm calling it Queer Studies in Social Science Research. A quick perusal of the keywords queer and/or LGBTQIA and India yield a plethora of scholarly work, both books and articles published nationally and internationally. Much like early feminist writing in India and many parts of the world, scholarly work in this field has also been by activists who are directly involved in various realms of mobilization of communities and struggles for rights. Given this trend, the history of queer studies has to begin with the scholarship on sexuality foregrounded by feminist activists. Whether it's the work on women's sexuality as discussed in the public sphere from the 19th century onwards in colonial debates on legislations, to expositions of discourses on sexuality in the Women's Writing in India volumes, or the earliest text on women's health brought out by the Sri Shakti Sangatna based in Hyderabad, Any iconic feminist text that all of you must be all too familiar with through your women's studies educations will include discussions of sexuality as a crucial aspect to consider while making sense of state, family, and society. This coincided with the women's movement's campaigns against violence against women, which was and still is continuing with a strong focus on the interconnectedness with questions of socioeconomic rights, questions of family, culture, the nation state, etc. Feminist writing emerging from Dalit experiences and experiences of women in Kashmir, the northeast of India, Chhattisgarh, etc., are all at the helm of this interconnected analysis. I will not make an exhaustive list of this literature, but will simply put on the table the fact that the scholarship emerging out of India that is grounded in women's studies and feminist analysis has, one, been in tandem with social movements for rights and change, and two, have had sexuality at the center of their axes of analysis. So that's my first point. It is in this background that the earliest articulations of LGBT identity emerge. And here I use a stunted acronym without including LGBTQIA, as that would be anachronistic. A spate of books by scholars who were LGBT themselves emerged, such as Ashwini Suktankar's Facing the Mirror, Geeti Thadani's Sakhiani, Hoshang Merchant's Yarana, all in the feminist tradition of subversive politics, finding its place first within the realm of literature. These were all texts that brought together LGBT writing. Around the same time, the first text based on historical scholarly research by Salim Kidwai and Ruth Vanita called Same-Sex Love in India came out. And this was all in the late 1990s. This book was to later become part of a significant argument to, I quote, prove the Indianness of non-normative sexualities. One of the earliest LGBT documents, however, was a report by the AIDS Bedbha Virodi Andolan called Less Than Gay that was released in 1991. And a similarly significant report was the Hamjinsi Resource Book on LGBT rights in India, brought out in 1999, collated and edited by Bina Fernandez. In the early to mid 2000s, a range of new scholarship emerged from the next generation of queer activists, lawyers, and scholars who are all one and the same, and me among them. Significant texts such as Because I Have a Voice, Law Like Love, Loving Women, Being Lesbians in Unprivileged India, Nothing to Fix on Medicalization of Homosexuality, which came out only in 2015, but many of us know the research for it was underway for close to 10 years or more, but few observations can be made about these texts that will help us eke out important lessons that queer studies can yield for social studies research on the whole, which is the purpose of today's talk. First, all of these texts are interdisciplinary and incorporate multiple genres of writing that work in tandem with one another. For example, there is fiction, including short stories and of history, anthropology, critical legal studies, political science, etc. Theorization of a range of concepts, including but not limited to human rights, social change, queer, heteronormativity, etc. Second, all of these texts were written in and edited by scholars who are also frontline activists, lawyers, artists, journalists. Many of us, while theorizing, were also engaged in addressing issues and assisting individual queers in living safer, fuller lives, and sometimes saving lives, and at other times failing to do so. We were drafting legal documents to challenge Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, but also a range of other legal work for queer folks who got embroiled in kidnapping, habeas corpus, domestic violence, divorce, and custody cases. And we were also writing in the popular media. In the early 2000s, there were regular columns in the Times of India, Indian Express, New Indian Express, Outlook Magazine, Marie Claire, etc. We were a collective of writers who wrote in them. Alternative Law Forum was one institutional space that held many of us. There were also other collectives such as the Nigah Media Collective in Delhi, the Anjuman JNU Students Queer Collective, the Labia Collective in Bombay, and of course, Voices Against 377, the broad network of women's rights, child rights, health rights, HIV/AIDS related organizations and collectives that was one of the parties to the case on Section 377. We were supported and mentored by our teachers. And for me personally, they were feminist scholars such as Nivedita Menon, Uma Chakravarti, Mary John, among many others. This literature then, and at least another generation of it to come in the late 2000s and early 2010s, emerged from politicized movement spaces. As scholars who are also queer, we spoke of us with utmost academic rigor, but we also spoke for ourselves. Third, and perhaps the most important contribution of this body of literature and future generations of queer theorization to social studies research was that these texts were critiques of activities by the very same people who engaged in those activities. We critiqued the extent to which the law can bring about social change, even while being engaged and central to a significant legal campaign to decriminalize adult consensual same-sex sexual activity. We wrote of the limits of the politics of identity, even as we identified ourselves through various identity tags in the public sphere. As such, a public sphere needed to see queers who they may deem worthy of rights. Thus, especially out with support from our families, such as myself with my mother being part of the petition from queer folks all the way up to the Supreme Court of India. We knew why we needed to identify ourselves, but in our theorization, we repeatedly critiqued identity boxes, that they make us legible to the law, but are never holistic in their description of us. Fourth, all our theorization, like our activism, saw that all forms of oppression are connected to one another, and one cannot be critiqued without another. So we wrote of sexual orientation, but also of class, religion, and less so of caste. Here, especially, the writings by and about queer persons assigned gender female at birth, who may identify as lesbian or trans or any other such identity category, questioned the very basis of society as they challenged reproduction as the sole purpose of human relationships and forefronted pleasure non-central to their intimate, private, and public lives, thus standing heteronormativity on its head. It is from these formulations that the definition of queer, as articulated in Menon's essay in Because I Have a Voice, and many others since then emerged. That any persons who seek to challenge and live outside any of the oppressive norms of society, be it class, caste, etc., shall be considered queer. Thus, heterosexuality does not have to cast you out of queerness as long as you are open to and engaged in questioning all societal norms that make society unequal. And homosexuality doesn't automatically make you queer if while being homosexual, you also support and affirm or do not challenge existing oppressive social norms of caste, class, etc. This definition of queer I find more hopeful and a more positive alternative to Jasbir Puar's idea of homonormativity, although I'm fully empathetic to the regressive conditions of homosexuals partaking in blatant human rights violations that she's writing about and in the context of. So the scholarship mentioned above continued on with a whole other generation of scholars coming up who also engaged in activism, such as the works of Akhil Katyal, Ranjita Biswas, Navneeta Mukhil, and so many others. And there were many more reports, like from Labia in Bombay, Saheli in Delhi, apart from the regular reports that came out of NGOs on queer and LGBT issues. So to top off this survey of queer theorization that's firmly grounded in the above mentioned facets, one may look for more recent writings by long-term queer activists who found the time to sit down and write, and feminist foremothers and forepersons, such as Chainika Shah, Charles Mahajan, Jaya Sharma, Pramada Menon, Radhika Chandramani, and the continuing writing by Ruth Vanita, Maya Sharma, among many others. So here, there's yet another crucial element that is of note. Many of us who are part of creating this body of scholarship are not queer studies scholars or queer activists alone. Gautam Bhan, who edited Because I Have a Voice, for example, is a teacher and practitioner of urban studies. Arvind Narayan is a human rights lawyer who has worked on a range of human rights issues, from caste issues to land issues and the violation of democratic right to dissent. I personally am an oral historian, a Tamil studies scholar, and a historian of the Dravidian movement, and a historian of indentureship and Caribbean studies. As a lawyer, I worked on labor issues, especially with informal workers such as domestic workers, sex workers, and sanitation workers, most of whom are Dalit. I have worked for the past 2 decades through the war in Sri Lanka and the war-torn Tamil-speaking areas, and have now chosen to live here. This is important because as soon as we could find some respite from everyday LGBTQIA frontline activism, we pursued our respective academic and other interests that are seemingly different from all things queer. But anything that we do, the perspective that is brought upon the world through queer activism and analysis is an integral part of our work. Right now, there is an outpouring of work on LGBTQIA studies and queer studies in India across every discipline, from psychology to media and cyber studies. That is a sign of space in the public sphere that we have secured through struggle over the past 3 decades. But we are also at the precipice of a dangerous trend of members of the LGBTQIA community not just being mute participants, but propagators of casteist, neoliberal, fascist notions of the Indian nation state, including but not limited to Hindutva capitalism. On the other end of the spectrum is the voices of hitherto relatively invisibilized queer bodies who exist beyond dichotomous gender, who are Dalit, who are living with disabilities. So while many among us continue to do what we have always done, view everything with astute criticality, including ourselves, participating fervently in self-reflection, have constantly acknowledged these absences, but have also been working constantly to make for a queer space that is increasingly egalitarian. Some among these marginalized groups are denying any presence in the queer movement at all, ever, and this is a historical fallacy. The struggle to make egalitarian spaces is never ending. And the coming of voices and bodies that jolt us all out of our comfortable positions and force us to reflect upon our limitations and expand our political rigor and creativity are what makes scholarship and activism vibrant. But there is a large number of queers who believe, for instance, that the right to marriage and other civil rights is a logical next step for the queer movement. And they run the danger of tacitly supporting the conservative, fascist LGBTQIA voices. Those on the supposed radical end of the spectrum will not speak to all of these people at all, as they will be relegated to being casteist, elitist, etc., unless they can speak with the same fire in the belly to be connected in the ranks of the radical activists. So it is in this context that I lay out below what queer studies has contributed in terms of frames of analysis and ethos to social science research. And similar teachings can be made for different realms, whether it's social activism, whether it's making art, but today I shall focus on academic work. This, what follows, is based on knowing the multiple areas of interest of many Indian queer theorists, and from my own experience of reading and writing academic material that is not primarily about queerness. And here I keep saying the term Indian because it's a category we chose for the sake of the law. And one of the many areas that remains unwritten are the different connections and solidarities across many different places, from queers from different parts of South Asia and the world. But for today, I'm just going to pretend like there is a category called India. First, a queer perspective has the potential to leave no stone unturned when it comes to recognizing normative structures. As sexuality lives in the body and in our most intimate spaces, a perspective that is true to this reality cannot, in effect, uphold any societal structure. It hits at the core of anything being assumed to be natural: bodies, desires, genders, and sexualities. There are never any definitive answers to many questions about how all our lives manifest in this realm. Much of it is the subject of human experience and desire, and any generalization of the same is impossible from a queer perspective. Normative structures, on the contrary, have as their foundation constant generalizations about humans, naturalizing these generalizations and policing any aberrations of them. So a queer perspective, in essence, must bring into question all structures of oppression that paint human beings in broad and single brushstrokes, as queerness knows of the intricacies, and it does not shy away from it. Second, a queer perspective, while making amply visible the structures of oppression we live within, it also forefronts the specificities and uniqueness of each human being. The Pride marches did a very telling thing to the slogan, which in Hindi goes, "Awaaz do, hum ek hai," which means say together that we are one. At Pride, we changed that to "Hum anek hai," we are many. Queerness revels in the uniqueness of each human being and believes in room for each person to be able to grow and blossom with freedom and dignity. A queer perspective draws strength from diversity and difference. It gives room for empathy that can be all-encompassing. Third, a queer perspective takes us into the mucky interiors of power relations. From our most intimate spheres of love, romance, and physical relationships to social relationships with those that we are connected to by kinship or those that we choose to be connected to, a queer perspective reminds us that as human beings, we are all constantly embroiled in negotiations of power. It breeds honesty about the fact that none of us are pure in our relationship with power and hegemony, and that it is a much more complicated territory. A queer perspective can see the relationship between this struggle and the normative larger structures of power. So this process is not relegated to the rarefied arena of individual angst, but is actually connected to broader social structures. At another talk on queer archives, I spoke of how queers have fought for entry into the archives as legible subjects, and we must now put our money where our mouth is and reflect on our own archives and see where are the Dalits, where are the poor, where are the trans folks, where are the persons living with disabilities, where are the sex workers. I can do this, as so many of us have done for 2 decades now, because queerness has led us to understand that power is deeply mediated by individual experience, social processes, historical time, etc. A queer perspective keeps us awake to our own relationships with power, from our intimate spheres all the way to the world at large in our work, as among other things, social science researchers. So for example, queer perspectives loves love, but it isn't naive about how it has a complex relationship with power. Fourth, precisely this comfort with an analysis of power that is honest and not duplicitous leaves us with the need to create our own versions of intimacies, networks of love and support. We do not have ready-made models of family, partnership, romance, etc. We have to make it all up as we go along. It may sound strenuous, but the honesty of this process, even though never-ending and lifelong, makes it worthwhile. It provides a deep and real happiness. Many of us have noticed that creating these, and I don't want to say alternative, I don't like that word because it affirms the norm, but creating these hitherto unseen structures of trust, love, and support to move through the world are the most creative answers you may find to the hegemonies of caste, class, religion, heteronormativity, etc. So it doesn't just critique that which is forced upon us as a norm, but it creates and lives other ways of being in the world, ways that are consistently honest, sensitive, reflexive, and ever changes. And that makes room for individual and collective growth with dignity, love, and happiness. And how you are supported plays a crucial role in the work that you produce and how you participate in the public sphere and how you see the world. And so these structures and living in them provides for a perspective on the world that is unafraid of breaking out of norms as it has already found a home. These are but four main paradigms that I think can be applied by any researcher, at least in the social sciences. I don't know about the other disciplines. But you may notice I don't use much the terms LGBTQIA. This is a conscious choice. A simplistic articulation of any identity does not guarantee the embodiment of the ethos outlined above. Whether such identities are wielded to become part of the norm, such as those who want to marry and reproduce all the oppressions of caste, class, religion, monogamy, private property that are intrinsic to the institution of marriage, or if you want to wield your identity to declare a position of quote unquote pure descent, which is seen as unpolluted by any complex relationships of power, either way, you're still framed by the structures of oppression and are in a box either within or against it. The ethos suggested above, it's non-dichotomous, and thus it's steeped in the complex realities of human existence. This then makes for a radical breach of violent ways of being and thinking about the world that always brings us up against a wall, a disciplinary wall, a wall of normativity, or any other. Instead, it provides for a space that can be infinite and is yet broadly and strongly rooted to the lives of human beings, our own and that of the others. This is of utmost use to any social science researcher, and if you let them influence how you think through your research, the results will be apparent, and I'm more than happy to discuss what this may look like practically. And I'd like to end with a small example of how this manifested in my own PhD research. So I have 4 chapters and it's 300 pages. God knows who's going to read it. But there's an entire chapter which tries to map the hegemony of caste through listening to silences in the conversation. The entire framing of the entire thesis is based on spatiality and how public spaces are ridden with caste and private spaces are kept away from public politics. I have an entire chapter on very ironically male deep, 2 chapters actually, on deep connections that men feel with one another in the Dravidian movement. These are working class men in a small town in Tamil Nadu. One chapter is about a friendship between just 2 men who belong to 2 different political strands. And another chapter is about a gym, and that gym became the place where they exercised their minds and bodies and became political beings. So when I go in for fieldwork, the reason why I was able to see a lot of these things, I owe it to a great extent to, of course, a feminist perspective. But what the queer perspective adds to that is that it leaves no room for any assumptions about what the fundamental attachment is of the people I'm doing research about, any overemphasis on kinship or blood family. And it makes me a better researcher because I will have to scrutinize all available categories and structure with the utmost rigor because I'm fundamentally also a queer scholar. So I think I'll stop there and hopefully we can have a conversation because I didn't want to go on and on for an entire hour. So that's my time. You can ask me questions in Hindi, English, and Kannada if you wish. I'm sorry, the talk, there's not enough structure set up for translation, but I'm happy to take question in the other 3 languages that I know as well.
I have a question, but if a guest would like to ask a question first.
Arvi, are you speaking to me?
I have a question.
Yeah, go
But if
for it.
somebody else has a question, they can go first. All right. So this is a question that is not. I said this because it's not related to your speech, but it's related to your work. And it is both a question that's deeply important to the community and to myself personally. So I'll phrase it this way. I want to think about gender neutral pronouns in Tamil, and I don't know where to start thinking about them. So to provide some context, there are gender neutral pronouns in Tamil, for instance, our, but they come with the connotation of respect and an implied relationship between the addresser and the addressee. So where do we start thinking about gender neutral pronouns?
Shall I answer that or wait for a few more questions?
Ma'am, it's entirely up to you, whichever way you prefer structuring it.
Okay. So I wrote an article which never saw the light of day, but perhaps it should. And it was called Being Queer the Vernacular Way. And essentially it was about articulations of, or more like experiences of queerness in Tamil rather than in English. And it makes a few different arguments. And I may say things differently now. I haven't looked at it in many, many years. But a few points that it makes from what I remember is that some of the, you know, portioning out of rights or all of those things are English formations, you know. So when we say urimehal, it's like tani, what was I saying? To speak of each urimai separately, you know, each right separately, it's counterintuitive in Tamil. But in the post-Second World War context, in the English language, that's not counterintuitive at all. And then, of course, about gender-neutral pronouns. And I did write at that time that it's really welcome that in Tamil, but also Hindi, also Kannada, that there are, you know, the respectful nangal or ningal or avar, etc., which we can use, which already exists. But we know that that has connotations of hierarchy based on age, based on caste, etc. But of course, it's hilarious because I now live in Sri Lanka, where in many parts they even refer to little children with the respectful, you know, Ninga Vanga Ponga. And so we make fun of that. So Tamil also lives differently in different places. So I don't know concretely where to start. But over the years, I have kind of evolved some principles of what we could do. I think one, it needs to be something that can be very all pervasive in our speech, so that if people actually have the intention to de-gender dichotomize their speech, then they have to use these words and they have to keep practicing. Get it wrong and we won't cancel them and shout at them on Twitter if they do, but practice, practice, practice till it enters your body and the change is deep, right? So I think it has to be something that's all pervasive, that you have to use in the language. And when you bring in words from far, far away, which are more literal, etc., I think that brings in another form of hierarchy. But other than that, I think one of the things that I like doing is to use people's names directly, at least for a little while, at least till we figure out what to do. Because I think there is a way in which it disrupts language, it disrupts the way we speak, it disrupts sentence structure. And it also provides the space and respect for the person, especially when the names are chosen. Then all the more reason to kind of keep using it, and it still indicates in Tamil a certain kind of respect, but not with the same not with the same kind of distance as the Ninga Vanga Ponga does in Tamil Nadu, not in Sri Lanka. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I don't have many more at this point, but thanks for bringing it up. I think all the Tamil speakers here can think about it, and the others for their respective languages.
Thoughts on Adu?
Didn't hear you.
Sorry, I wanted to ask if you had any thoughts on Adu.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely not. It's Agrinay, no? It denies life, no, in Tamil grammar. So yeah, my instinctive response is absolutely not. But I'm sure some more thought can go into it, but I feel pretty sure that just I think the denial of life is something that I can't get behind. So yeah.
So a little bit of context that I would,
human life. Yeah.
a little bit of context that I would add to that is that in a lot of working class sociolects of Tamil, Adu is used in a non-disrespectful manner, in a manner that is almost comparable to Uyardinai, when in a manner that is essentially Uyardinai when referring to women, not in a disrespectful way. So
yeah, no, I'm also from Madras, but the thing is that requires a certain kind of intimacy, no?
Yes,
I can't call you Adu because I don't know you. I can call someone I know and love and already respect Adu in certain formations of Tamil, no?
Absolutely. So the very next thing I was about to say was that so this plays out beautifully in trans communities where Ava and Adu are used interchangeably, almost like the difference almost being dramatic.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if it's possible to suggest that to the world at large, simply because it's so easy for it to slip into disrespect. And I worry about that, given that the existing context of disrespect is already there. Yeah. But something to think about, slowly but surely.
Thank you very much, Ponni, for being here. This is Manimeklai, and I could not get network proper, and therefore I could not listen to your complete speech. But still, I was there for some time and really fascinated over the kind of presentation you were making about the queer perspective and how you've been involved in. And continuation of what has been discussed just now is also about this Adu is highly patriarchal. It is happening there to women also. The very it starts from the family, and in Tamil we say agrinai. You don't even respect that there is they are the human beings. So it is not a surprise that it has been referred to the other whole lot of LGBTIA groups also. So that is one thing. And second is how the two things which I wish to place here. One is that there are growing literature and growing participation on this whole lot of issues of LGBTA, but still people are not really it's not mainstreamed to even to the extent that we would wish to. Things are of course happening to accommodate and be inclusive, but it is not in the way in which it is expected. So there is a kind of a reservation that still on, and there is a whole lot of 90% of the population are not at all aware of the these group of people and their rights. So how long or how far to travel to get them also into mainstream thinking and discussions? So that is one question. And this not question is an actually throw some light on that. That is what. And second is that how the kind of differences in terms of class or caste which exist. Of course, you did touch on that also, but I could not hear proper. So if it is a repetition, please leave it. Otherwise, what is the kind of a difference you observe in this LGBTQIA group also? The kind of differences, caste and class differences, and how it is taken by the marginalized. The marginalized, there is an marginalization, then sub-marginalization. So how for people like some privileged group, they are able to voice out for others, and whether the other completely marginalized groups in terms of lower income group or rural, less educated, and other groups, they are not able to voice out, could really making their point to people who are really working for the rights of this group. Please.
I think just in terms of the mainstreaming question, I actually think it's so much more complicated than that, because since the reading down of Section 377, there's been the kind of mainstreaming that has scared many of us, and it didn't come out of nowhere. We knew of casteist, Hindu fascist, LGBTQIA voices for a long time. And they are coming out of Madurai, they are coming out of Bombay, all kinds of places. And that's really scary. And it's not unique to India, because one of the things that queer struggles all over the world have in common is that once there was a certain acquisition of rights under the law, etc., on the one hand, there is ongoing violence of those amongst us who are the most marginalized, who do not pass, who are the most visibly queer, those who are poor, who are homeless, who are living with disabilities, people who live as women or who are assigned gender female at birth. So these are the marginalized groups amongst us. And they continue to go through violence. And then on the other hand, there is the privileged groups from within the LGBTQIA communities who start spouting different forms of conservative politics, whether it's racism, Zionism, and in our case, of course, it's Hindutva. And then this works hand in hand with money and capitalism, and a large number of companies that are coveting the pink rupee, etc., which also started a long time ago, and it's just a continuation of the pink dollar. So I think our concerns with mainstreaming are on how to continue the conversation across different members who may see themselves to be part of LGBTQIA communities, who have begun to differ so thoroughly on broader politics. And the thing is, I think from the beginning, there was a big group of us who always were connected in our, I don't like the word intersectionality, because it assumes there are sections. And I don't believe our feminist politics or women's movement has taught us that you can't separate oppressions into sections anyway. And when there are no sections, then there's no intersectionality. And intersectionality emerged as a legal concept, not a social concept, but that's a different lecture. So we have always been interconnected in our struggles against oppression. And we held together alliances with lots of different people because we had this overarching enemy of this law that criminalized us all, etc. And the end of that has opened up a lot of different spaces. And that's what I tried to present. So I think those are my main concerns. The need for civil rights is not something to be taken lightly. And many of us have been speaking and writing about how we can reimagine civil rights not to fit within existing models of how civil rights are given to citizens in any country, but to reimagine how that's given for anybody, actually, heterosexual or whatever else, in a way that makes space for different units of support that are of our choosing, which doesn't centralize coupledom, etc. And there's many arguments, social, cultural, and legal, we can make for that. So the conflation of civil rights with existing legal, social, and cultural notions of how we may get them, which is centered on marriage, is a problem. And the biggest issue with that is not that it exists as a option, it exists as the only option in the minds of so many. And then just like everywhere else in the world, while the elite want to get married and do IVF and have babies and dogs and cats, poor Dalit trans folks and others are languishing on the street and are experiencing violence every day. So I think that would be my response to the mainstreaming question, actually. And in terms of queer lives per se, I think queer lives in India and the queer movement have always had many, many layers. And much of the literature is not all encompassing of those layers. Even my own presentation today is not all encompassing, because I think, yes, on the one hand, the double, triple, many layers of oppression that's on certain members of LGBTQIA communities is very real. And that's not my reality, for example. But then on the other hand, there are also important lessons of how intimacies can get negotiated in smaller places and in smaller worlds. And people have been living lives like that. And I personally have always found it truly inspiring. And I'm seeing more of this here in a context where there is no space, no conversation whatsoever on any aspect of sexuality, leave alone LGBTQIA stuff. And yet you find people falling in love and living and wanting to be with each other, etc. And I think that not adequate, far from adequate work has been done, which is focused research on how these different forms of oppression interact with each other on queer lives. So some of my own work with Priya Tangaraja, for example, it doesn't frame the women we are talking about, people assigned gender female at birth, who identify as lesbian women or trans men, and the papers we've written on how the law affects them. It doesn't frame itself as being about the members of caste and class-based oppressed communities also, but they are. Some of them are of lower caste and some of them are not. Many of them are poor and some of them are not. So I think there is still a need to take a long think and reflect about how these different realities interact with each other and start creating literature that opens up conversation rather than shuts it down on these subjects. I think that's an urgent need, and I would rather be doing that than fighting to get married and own private property.
Thank you. There is a question there on the chat box also. Is it possible for you to, or shall I read it?
Yeah, I can see. How do you locate queer ecology of commons? High Theory has just entered this room, Samhita. So I think one of the most beautiful things about understanding an ecology of commons in the context of queerness is how and this is what I was trying to present earlier, is how it breaks down the different boundaries between the affective and those that are traditionally seen as belonging to the public sphere. So the idea of the commons is deepened and made more expansive from a queer perspective, I think. Uh, because the way that one makes sense of human life from a queer perspective doesn't really allow for those boundaries to be firm. So I think there's a lot of potential there. But if there's any literature you want to share with people, Samhita, you can absolutely leave it here in our chat box.
Yeah, if there are no more questions, I think the moderator can do whatever.
Thanks so much, Manimeli.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ponni, for accepting our invitation. It was not much time given, but immediately you agreed. So, and also very much delighted to have you here on the line, on this online, and listen to your lecture. I think there are issues of connecting. So my own students are not able to join. Much of them, they just sent
Yeah.
message. They are not able to because of the connectivity. But anyway, it is
Yeah.
available on the YouTube, and we will share that. So thank you very much for being
Okay,
here
great.
once again, friends.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So who is the moderator who can conclude
Arabi,
here?
Yes.
Arvi.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, Manimegre.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
for
Sorry, I
thank you
joined
for
late.
giving
I
me
could
the
not.
note.
Yeah.
I would have forgotten it and felt bad about it afterwards. Thanks for that. Thank you, everyone. We will close the meeting in 2 or 3 in a minute or so. So please do click on the link in the chat for the feedback form and give us your feedback. With that, I think if anybody has any objections, speak now or forever hold your silence, and we will end the call. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the participants and also for Ravi for moderating.